Solon was a great lawgiver of Athens, who was probably born around 630 BC. This is the man who would give human history the first vision of what the government of a free society might look like. And prior to the enactment of his laws, Plutarch writes, the Athenians fell into their old quarrels about the government. There being as many different parties as there were diversities in the country, the hill quarter favored democracy, the plain oligarchy, and those that lived by the seaside stood for a mixed sort of government, and so hindered either of the other parties from prevailing. And the disparity of fortune between the rich and poor at that time also reached its height, so that the city seemed to be in a truly dangerous condition, and no other means for freeing it from disturbances and settling it to be possible but a despotic power. Then the wisest of the Athenians, perceiving Solon was of all men the only one not implicated in the troubles, that he had not joined in the exactions of the rich, and was not involved in the necessities of the poor, pressed him to succor the commonwealth and compose the differences. He was chosen archon, and empowered to be an arbitrator and lawgiver. Now Solon already had a reputation as an arbiter because of his role during the Solonian pollution. The Solonian pollution was a dispute between a faction surrounding a man named Solon and a faction surrounding a man named Megacles, and Solon managed to convince those who had been accused of pollution to submit to a proper trial. Now the fact that Solon achieved eminence just by convincing some people to submit to a form of dispute resolution, a trial, this shows us the state of Athenian society and the difficulty that they faced in getting the people to submit to some sort of legitimate authority. We see these lines, in the midst of these distractions, the city was disturbed with superstitious fears and strange appearances, and the priests declared that the sacrifices intimated some villainies and pollutions that were to be expiated. And the solution to this, as it turns out, that they get from this guy Epimenides from Crete, is to build sacred buildings, the foundations of sacred buildings, by that means making them, as in the people, more submissive to justice and more inclined to harmony. These lines show us two things. The first is going to be a theme in this video, and that is dealing with the constant threat of civil strife in Athens. A few strange appearances can get everybody on edge. And the second thing that this anecdote shows us is through the solution that a few sacred buildings were beneficial to the mentality of the people because they offered visual reaffirmation of the state's solid bulwark. It shows us the fundamental level at which the ancient Athenians are considering the best means by which they might civilize the human species. How about a building or two? Then they won't get spooked so easily. These are the conversations that were being had, and these were the circumstances under which Solon had to consider what the best laws would be. The first thing he did was to deal with the problem of indebtedness, and it's interesting to read this section in full. Solon's contrivance, who called canceling debts Sysactia, a relief or disencumbrance, for the first thing which he settled was that what debts remained should be forgiven, and no man for the future should engage the body of his debtor for security. So prior to Solon, you could take a loan out with your enslavement as the collateral. If you default, you are your creditor's slave. So Solon has done away with this, and he has forgiven the debts. In doing this, he must have taken a very great risk, because in canceling the debts, you pour cold water on the flow of capital, because who would want to be a lender if there was a chance the borrower would never have to pay you back at all? So Solon might have felt justified in doing this because of the widespread servitude from borrowing in a way that uses your body as security. But unfortunately, Solon is our only source for the fact that there was this widespread servitude. And indeed, he paints a grim picture that people were off in foreign lands, that people were slaves at home, people had been away for so long that they had forgotten their own language. He paints a grim picture of how it was and gives himself credit for their liberation. We might wonder if he felt like he wasn't getting enough credit. And let us not rule out the potential ingratitude for those very people that Solon sought to help, that a person would want to risk slavery in order to get that loan. And this is just the sort of policy, by the way, that everyone hates. In America, if someone did this, you would hear right-wingers complaining that he had meddled with the economy, and left-wingers complaining that he didn't launch a full-scale reformation that equalized everyone, which is exactly what happened. Plutarch writes, "In this he pleased neither party, for the rich were angry for their money, and the poor that the land was not divided, and as Lycurgus ordered in his commonwealth, all men reduced to equality." So this being said, the people kind of came around over time. Plutarch tells us, becoming sensible of the good that was done, they laid by their grudges. So the next thing Solon did was to change the criminal punishments, which had been previously ordained by a man named Draco, from whom we have the phrase draconian laws. Plutarch writes, "He repealed all Draco's laws, because they were too severe, and the punishment too great, for death was appointed for almost all offenses, in so much that those that were convicted of idleness were to die." So we know why we disagree with the death penalty for people like thieves. Never minding that we consider that to be unjust to execute thieves. It is also a very stupid idea, because if the thief is going to be executed, he might as well murder all of his victims so as to not get caught. But there is still a further reason for this, which is that citizens are unlikely to inform against each other for small offenses if they know the penalty is death. And that's an issue. Thomas Jefferson considered this concept as well in his bill for proportioning crimes and punishments. Jefferson writes, "Cruel and sanguinary laws defeat their own purpose. By engaging the benevolence of mankind to withhold prosecutions, to smother testimony, or to listen to it with bias." And Jefferson continues with, "If the punishment were only proportioned to the injury, men would feel it their inclination as well as their duty to see the law observed." So Solon and Jefferson would very much see eye to eye on the importance of encouraging a sense of civic duty in each individual citizen. And Plutarch quotes Solon as having said, "Of the best modeled city, that where those that are not injured try and punish the unjust as much as those that are." And to this end, Plutarch tells us that under Solon's laws, if anyone was beaten, maimed, or suffered any violence, any man that would and was able might prosecute the wrongdoer. So any Athenian citizen can make themselves into a prosecutor of criminals. If Plutarch made the Sparta of Lycurgus sound like it might appeal to those who envision a society of equal wealth, the Athens of Solon shows us a place where the individual was encouraged to take matters into their own hands. You could not drink from your neighbor's well until you had first tried to dig a well of your own. And if they had dug 10 fathoms deep and could find no water, they had liberty to fetch a pitcherful from their neighbors. For he, as in Solon, thought it prudent to make provision against want, but not to supply laziness. Now this empowerment of the individual was taken to the extent that, as Plutarch writes, he permitted anyone to kill an adulterer that found him in the act. More on that later. Okay, so Solon also had a law against being neutral during a sedition. Plutarch tells us that he passed a law which disenfranchises all who stand neuter in a sedition, for it seems he would not have anyone remain insensible and regardless of the public good, and securing his private affairs, glory that he has no feeling of the distempers of his country, but at once join with the good party, and those that have the right upon their side assist and venture with them, rather than keep out of harm's way. So this law could have had any number of purposes. But I think Solon obviously wanted to curtail the factional strife in Athens by making the individual personally accountable. If there is a growing rebellion that seeks to overthrow the government, if you want the state to safeguard your goods and your property as though you're living in a time of peace, then you have an obligation to defend it from sedition. And if the state perseveres over a sedition or a rebellion, and they put down the strife without your help, they come and get your property. You didn't bother to pitch in. So this may seem a little absurd to us. Maybe on some extent we like it. But this is a good place to remember that the Athenian polis was one city, and the population size is discussed by the historian Mary Beard here.
Classical Athens was a very small place. There were perhaps 40,000 people, not all citizens, living in the city itself. That makes it roughly the size of the University of Manchester.
So ancient Athens was not the impersonal mass of red and blue states that we see on election day in America. It was a tight-knit democracy with a small population where everyone knew everybody's business, and under those circumstances, different laws made sense for them, particularly ones that forced you to show an interest in what was going on around you. But regarding this law against being neutral during a sedition, you were allowed to be neutral, as I read this, under all other circumstances other than sedition. You didn't have to take a stance on the pressing political issue of the day. As long as there wasn't armed rebellion in the streets, you could be as neutral as you liked. So Solon took other measures to prevent civil discord, which includes curbs on speech. So this is interesting. Plutarch writes, "Another commendable law of Solon's is that which forbids men to speak evil of the dead. For it is pious to think the deceased sacred and just, not to meddle with those that are gone, and politic to prevent the perpetuity of discord. He likewise forbade them to speak evil of the living, in the temples, the courts of justice, the public offices, or at the games, or else to pay 3 drachmas to the person and 2 to the public." All right, so first let's understand the value of the drachma so that we can see the extent of the punishment. In another section, Plutarch says, a sheep and a bushel were both estimated at a drachma. So it's the cost of a sheep, 3 sheep. 3 drachmas would buy you 3 sheep. That's the price if you said something ill of the living in the wrong place. So if we dislike this curtailment of free speech, even in modern America, we do not grant unlimited license to speech in public. States, cities, schools, and municipalities are empowered within a reasonable scope to limit certain speech. And usually the remedy against the individual, against the speaker who violates that restriction, is usually to just remove them from the site. But in Athens, the remedy was that they should pay. So there is something, I hate to say it, that I like about this, and that is this. Remembering, of course, that this law seems to be against speech that is personally insulting, rather than pure political speech. If you wanted to proclaim something bad about someone, you could do it and pay the 5 drachmas. You could make a determination that it was worth it. So it better be serious, right? And if you did, that may have given extra weight to what you had to say, because people knew that you were willing to pay for it. You could put your money where your mouth is. That's just, I don't know. It'd be very easy for me to sit here and just say, that's awful. Talking about this law, about speech, about slanderous speech, Plutarch writes this: "For never to be able to control passion shows a weak nature and ill breeding, and always to moderate it is very hard, and to some impossible, and laws must look to possibilities." Now along these lines, the 17th century philosopher known as Benedict of Spinoza said this about controlling our words. Spinoza writes, "Not even the most experienced, to say nothing of the multitude, know how to keep silence." So no one's really competent to shut up. It is true. So now as to the Athenian form of government. He divided the people of Athens into what Dryden translates as 4 tribes, based on a graded system according to your wealth. Here is how Aristotle puts it. He divided the people by assessment into 4 classes: 500 measure man, horseman, teamster, and laborer. Now Plutarch tells us the 500 measure men were determined so among those that were worth 500 measures of fruit, dry, and liquid. So it's based on what comes out of your land. Now Rackham translates the Aristotle as mentioning teamsters. Plutarch calls them zoigatai, and their land produces 200 units. So from these groups, Plutarch writes, he formed another council of 400, 100 out of each of the 4 tribes, which was to inspect all matters before they were propounded to the people. So that's in addition to the Areopagus, which was much more of an exclusive group, and it had the greatest power. Here is how Aristotle describes it: that Solon appointed to the council of the Areopagus to the duty of guarding the laws, and it was this council that kept watch over the greatest number and the most important of the affairs of state, in particular, correcting offenders with sovereign powers both to fine and punish, and making returns of its expenditure to the Acropolis without adding a statement of the reason for the outlay. So the Areopagus was in charge of all things pertinent to the running of the government, including the justice against actual state employees and officers. And the people who were least propertied were not admitted to any office, but could come to the assembly and act as jurors, which at first seemed nothing, but afterwards was found an enormous privilege, as almost every matter of dispute came before them in this latter capacity. So I want to return to that law where it's okay to kill an adulterer, and we have to add this. If you're going to kill an adulterer and you married an heiress, you better make sure that's not your brother or your uncle and you're in bed with her, because regarding marriages, under Solon's laws, Plutarch writes, "It seems an absurd and foolish law, which permits an heiress, if her lawful husband fail her," as in is impotent and can't do anything, "to take his nearest kinsman." Plutarch explains, "This law was well contrived against those who, conscious of their own unfitness, yet, for the sake of the portion, as in her wealth, would match with heiresses. Now, since she can quit him for who she pleases, they would either abstain from such marriages, or continue them with disgrace, and suffer for their covetousness." Now, furthermore, Solon's laws included this one: "The law that the bride and bridegroom shall be shut in a chamber and eat a quince together, and that the husband of an heiress shall consort with her thrice a month. For though there be no children, yet it is an honor and due affection which a husband ought to pay to a virtuous and chaste wife." I think it's interesting that in ancient Athens, the husband of an heiress required the law to force him to consort with her 3 times a month. And I guess this is, in England, this is an expression to eat a quince together. I guess this is the origin of that. And what do we think about 3 times a month? Anyway, in all other marriages, he forbade dowries be given. The wife was to have 3 suits of clothes, a little inconsiderable household stuff, and that was all. For he would not have marriages contracted for gain or an estate, but for pure love, kind affection, and birth of children. So Solon voluntarily ended his political career, bought a trading vessel, and having leave for 10 years' absence, departed. And he left Athens. And when he returned, unfortunately Athens was on the path to a tyranny under a tyrant by the name of Pisistratus, who we will get to in the next video. So Solon's legacy, at least his immediate legacy, bequeathed Athens a tyranny. But according to Plutarch, Pisistratus kept many of Solon's laws in place. And whatever we might think of them, obviously there's going to be a lot of these laws that we disagree with, this is still a starting point, and democracy had to start somewhere. And a lot of these things that Solon created are actually really important. This is a forerunner to the right to a trial by jury, which is really one of the most important rights we have. A jury of your peers has to say that you belong in prison. The state can't just do it alone. But Plutarch also tells us that Poplicola modeled the Roman Republic off of Solon's laws. Indeed, several of his laws, Plutarch writes, he actually transferred to Rome as his empowering the people to elect their officers and allowing offenders the liberty of appealing to the people, as Solon did to the jurors. And regarding the inability to please people, this is what Solon said, perhaps at a point in his life when he was bitter at the turn that Athens had taken, which is to say, the turn towards tyranny. Somebody asked him if he had left the Athenians the best laws that could be given. He replied, "The best they could receive."